Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today we're going to be talking all about the brand new Cinema 4D R19 Pro Render, the GPU rendering solution inside of Cinema 4D. Going to be talking about all the settings and if it's right for you. So let's learn about Pro Render. Alright, so here we are in Cinema 4D R19, and we are talking Pro Render today. And Pro Render is your physically based GPU render, just like Octane or Arnold, but it is built into Cinema 4D, so it's very tightly integrated. And how you get Pro Render working is by simply doing one thing: going to your render settings, going to your renderer drop-down menu, and going to Pro Render. And I'll just close out of that. And then to get our Pro Renderer moving and grooving, we just go up to the Pro Render menu and just say Start Pro Render. And what it's going to do is compile your shaders, and it's going to start doing its thing. Now, our scene is dark right now, and the main reason for that is that our Pro Render is physically based. If you do not have an environment or a light in your scene, everything is going to be dark. The only thing you can actually see in my viewport right now is a material with luminance turned on. So that's the only way you can actually, it's the only reason you can see all these elements over here. So what that means is we're using physically based lights, physically based materials, physically based HDR images that will cast that physically based light. So we need an environment or a light to be able to, light this scene. So what we're going to do is just use a sky object. Now, Pro Render does not use physical skies, so we need to use a normal sky. And you're going to see once I actually put a sky into my scene, boom, we have a default HDR material or HDR image that is now lighting and casting reflections onto our objects. And this is just the default HDR. If we actually go to render this, it's going to compile our shaders, and it's going to use that default HDR image in our render. If we actually want to change the default renderer, we can go into our mode, view settings, and go to Enhanced OpenGL, and you can see the actual environment override we have in here. You could choose your own default HDR image that you want, that will then just use that as the default. But you can change it in the Enhanced OpenGL, just twirl down the reflections, and you can choose whatever you want, whatever HDR image you want there. Or you can just go ahead, and one thing I want to call out is in the content browser, under the presets, prime folder, presets, light setups, HDR, the folder list just keeps going. In that HDRI folder, we have a bunch of HDR image that comes free with your Cinema 4D install. So I just kind of dragged a few of these in here, so we can just drag another one in here if we want. And then we can go ahead and drag and drop those HDR images onto our sky object. And you're going to see that this is updating immediately. So we're getting real-time feedback, which is really, really awesome. If you're not used to, using Octane or anything like this, and this is your first taste of a GPU renderer, welcome. Welcome to the future. You're living it right now. But this is just a really cool thing to be able to see exactly how an HDR looks in your scene without having to apply a material, hit render, and then see what that looks like. We can actually just simply drag and drop a new HDR material on there. Boom, we see exactly what that looks like. So I'll just, let's see what this one looks like. And I'll just drag and drop that. And you can see, boom, just updates immediately, right? So really cool. I can move around here, and it's going to go through all these little iterations, and basically the longer this goes, the higher quality of the render is going to be. The sampling is going to improve the render quality here. And that's actually set to 50 right now due to my render settings that I have right now. So again, it's a built-in solution. Main benefit is it's fully compatible with most of the shaders in Cinema 4D. So your alphas, your gradients, your tiles, which is really important. You can see that I'm using an alpha tiles shader in my alpha. So that's fully supported. No need to convert anything. It does it automatically. All your textures are kind of baked out in the background, which is great for compatibility's sake. So it uses physically based lighting and materials. And the one thing you're going to notice is that we have this new Pbr Material function here. And if I just create that and open this up, you're going to see that everything is happening inside of the reflectance channel. So this is where the business goes on right in here. And everything is, it's not using a color channel, it's actually using a diffuse reflectance with this Lambertian diffuse, and we also have our default reflection as well. So all of these settings are physically based. Everything's living in the reflectance channel here. Because basically, if you think about it, how you look at objects in real life, what you're seeing, the diffused colors that you're seeing is based off of the light that's reflected off of your object. So basically all the light, everything you see in real life is a reflection. So that's kind of how the new materials are built in ProRender. That's kind of a main different thing. You could still use normal materials with your color and just your normal reflections. That works just as fine as well. You can have a little bit more creative control over how your diffuse works. And it's also great for, again, backwards compatibility. So PBR, physically based materials, we also have a physically based light. And you're going to notice that this is basically an area light with a lot of its options grayed out. Notice how you can't adjust the shadow. And again, this is because everything's physically based. A shadow only works in physics one way. So those are the laws that you have to you're bound to using physically based renderers. So that's kind of the downside, is that you can't get creative with, maybe you want a grainier shadow by jacking down jacking down a thing? Throwing down the accuracy here to get like a grainy shadow or something like that. The one thing you're going to notice is that we have this little black cube in our scene. And I dare you to send a client a render like this with that in there. They're probably not going to be very happy. But basically what that is this show in render. So we have a solid, basically you can see that this as a reflection in our object here. Basically you just want to turn off show and render and you'll get rid of that little black plane there. But you can keep that on if you want. So there's two ways. Let's actually just change this to like a disk. And this way we have like a nice little circle reflection in there. The one thing I want to point out is that there's two ways for physically based lights to be adjusted as far as light intensity goes. One is just by increasing the brightness or intensity of the light. The other way is by increasing or decreasing the size of that light. You can see that as I scaled down the light, it got darker. So again, physically based, if you have a small light source, it's going to emit way less light than a larger light source. So if I crank this up to 2000 and 2000, boom, this is just too much. It's almost like a massive overbright light source here. It's like you're interrogating the logo here because you're trying to get some information. So you shine that big hot light at it in the investigation room or whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about here. But yeah, two ways to adjust light power, basically. So there's your intensity, lower that. You know how that works just by your normal light workflow in like your standard renderer or physical renderers. All right, so that is lights. Another thing, I've done a tutorial on this. With area lights, we also have the option to use objects as lights as well, and I'll link that to this tutorial to check that out. But basically, I have this torus on the outside listed as a light source. You can see as I turn that on, I can have this nice bluish hue being cast by just this tube over here as this light source. So again, check out the tutorial all about using a light or an object as a light source and find out all about that. All right, so again, physically based, we don't have a lot of settings here. One thing that's going to be very important when you actually go to this these physically based renderers is it's very helpful to learn real-world lighting techniques as they translate directly to this type of workflow. So if you're not really boned up on your lighting techniques, definitely read some, movie books or something like that of how directors or, TDs, technical directors, kind of set up lightings and scenes and stuff like that. And my buddy David Ariew, he did an awesome Siggraph presentation all about, digital DPing and stuff like that. So I'll also link to his presentation. I learned a ton just on lighting. That's just a whole nother subject to really get into, and it applies directly to all these physically based renderers. All right, so we use sky objects to get our environments in here so we can actually reflect. The one thing I want to call out is that just like the physical sky is not supported by ProRender, neither is the floor object. So if you want a floor, make it using a disk or a plane. So that's kind of it for the PBR workflow and how all that works in ProRender and just physically based GPU renders in general. The next thing we can do is cover all of the render settings here. And again, because we're physically based, a lot of that creative push and pull that you're normally used to in like the standard render is no longer here, because physically based, everything has to, scientifically work just like it would in real life. So there's only so many things you can adjust. So we have two options: our preview render settings, which is our preview, our viewport settings here. So the iteration count, that's the iteration count to get our render quality for our preview. And offline is basically your fancy pants word for your picture viewer render, your final render. So let's just cover the general as well. The general tab, basically the only thing you need to worry about in here is the devices. So you can see that I'm using my new Mac Pro from 2013 and it's not using both of my dual Radeon cards here. So I just need to check on global override so I can make sure it's using both of my really lame Radeon Pro here cards from 2013. So yeah. So back to the preview. Let's just go over to these render modes here. So we got global illumination, which, is just like global illumination in your standard and physical. We have direct illumination without shadows. This is kind of, I think you use this as maybe a render pass, and then we just have ambient occlusion, which again, you could just render out your ambient occlusion pass and composite in After Effects or Nuke or whatever. We also have your depth of field that you can turn on, and again, that's all physically based. So scene scale and object scale is a big factor in how much depth of field you have as far as like how close your camera is. So again, it's just like a real camera. In real life, the closer you get to the object, the more depth of field and shallow depth of field you can get and stuff like that. The one thing you're going to see missing is, I always like to think of depth of field and motion blur as the same, one and the same, as they're both things you typically leave to render out as passes and then composite in After Effects using like Frischlift and real smart motion blur and all that stuff. Motion blur is not supported in this iteration, this first iteration of ProRender. So it's kind of like a downer. Another thing not supported is subsurface scattering, nor do multipasses work in ProRender. So kind of a bummer, but again, this is a first pass. I'm sure that Maxon is hard at work adding all those and implementing all of those features. So moving on to ray depth, basically ray depth is just bounces of light. So if we have just a ray depth of 1, you're going to get 1 bounce of light. So a light's going to get cast, a little ray of light's going to get cast from our sky, our HDRI, and our light. It's going to bounce 1 time back to the camera, and that's it. If you crank up the bounces or the ray depth, you're going to see that it's going to bounce and then reflect off of other objects in your scene. So maybe little nooks and crannies in your scene will then actually get some of the light because we have the bounces bouncing more than just 1 time. So it'll bounce off all the other things in your scene and come back to the camera. So it'll brighten up, those little nooks and crannies and corners. Again, this is just for your preview window here, but the offline also has a lot of the same settings, which we'll get to next. Your anti-aliasing sample set to 0 for your preview. Again, this is just like your anti-aliasing samples in other renderers. If I crank this to 1, you can see that we now have access to our filter, which All of this should be very familiar names, box, triangle, Gaussian, which is your animation filter in standard, or Mitchell, stuff like that. So box, I believe, if you go to your standard renderer, go to your anti-aliasing, you can see we have your still image cubic, which I think, we got box and all this other stuff. So a lot of the same lingo there. Let's go back to ProRender. So that's your filter size. Radiance clamp is basically, it helps you filter out all the overbright or blown out bright reflection values that may pop up in your scene. They're called fireflies, or like hot pixels. It's kind of like if you have a random burnt out pixel in your monitor or something like that, it kind of wipes all those away. But the most important settings in your render settings here, at least for your offline, is progressive rendering. This is the sampling count of how high quality your render is. So again, if I go to start ProRender here, you can see that we have the sampling, and it's set to 50 in my preview. So it's going to do a bunch of iterations up to 50, and then that's it. We're not going to keep removing and getting removing grain or noise and keep getting and improving that image. It's just going to stop at 50. So that's iteration count. You also can stop render at a time limit. So versus like a certain sample count, we can just do like, hey, 60 seconds, your time is up and you're done. That's all you get for each frame. And then we have never, which is basically your 3D version of watching paint dry. Only this is like watching paint dry for eternity. So, if you want to use that, knock yourself out. Have fun watching a render that never ends. But typically you want to stick with like iteration count. And if I bring this up to 100, you can see that in my viewport here, as long as I don't like move around or orbit, it's just going to keep tossing them, slinging those iterations out until it reaches 100, and then that's basically what you get. Preview resolution is basically, like your preview resolution in After Effects, where you can do like half quality, a fourth, you get bigger pixels and stuff like that. Just tries to speed up this viewport. Texture, default texture resolution, how ProRender handles things like tile shaders or gradient shaders or noise shaders is it actually bakes it down, just kind of like baking a texture that you'd normally do in Cinema 4D before. It bakes it down so it's compatible, and it's backwards compatible for other versions of Cinema 4D. So basically, this is your texture resolution when it actually compiles and bakes out those textures. So if you're seeing your textures look kind of blurry, just crank up your texture size in the X and Y to like 2K or whatever, and get a nice, sharper, clearer texture. So let's just go to our offline settings, and you actually have the ability to actually see the offline settings in your viewport here. So while we're messing around with this, we can actually do that. So we have a lot of the same settings as we did with the preview. One of the main things is this Firefly Filter, which I just said we get the little Firefly. When you actually have an actual bug, Firefly flying through your scene. No, Fireflies are actually just those little, hot pixels. Just tries to get rid of those. And then we have, level of detail. You can render the HUD if you want to do that. And then we have a lot of the same settings for our progressive rendering stop conditions, with one exception is this threshold. So threshold, we have a threshold in physical render and standard render as well, where basically the lower the number, the more it's going to blow out and just remove all your noise and grain, but it's also going to increase your render time. So the higher the number, the more grain, but the faster the render time. So threshold is one way you can do it as well, and have our little threshold here do its thing. But iteration count's typically what I like to stick at. And for a nice crystal clear render, sometimes you can find that you need to crank this up to 2000. And this is kind of one of the downsides of ProRender is I would not recommend it for animation. Is because a render like this, you can see how slowly this is kind of cranking. We just got to 20, and we got a long way to go. We're just 1% in the progress. You can see how much longer we'd need to wait before all the grain is removed, and it's quite a long time. So that's another shortcoming. So ProRender, I would say for right now, is great for really, really fast feedback. Again, you can see how the lighting is going to reflect and look in your scene, how an HDR image is going to look in your scene, and get that really instantaneous feedback. It's one of the main benefits of all the GPU renders out there, is that you're not, changing the camera view or changing a light and being like, okay, let's do a minute render and see how that looks like. It's like, boom, you get exact, precise, quick feedback just like that. So that's kind of one of the downsides, is that, we're not probably going to use this for animation. It's really good for product visualization, especially with exteriors lit using HDRIs. It's not so good for interiors from what I understand. So HDRIs, not good for animation, but I would say I would use this as like just a nice little preview to see how things look. Maybe dock this somewhere and then see how it looks like in physical render and actually animate it out. But it's a really good visual preview for how lights is, and it's super, super fast. So just to finish, it's a work in progress totally, and it's going to be really exciting to see where this goes. It's the first iteration of this, but I think the one huge thing is, if you're not into Octane or anything like that yet, this is going to prep you for working in that physically based GPU render and understanding things like physically based lighting and physically based material and getting used to that whole workflow. So I think that's really important, even if you think you're eventually going to go to Octane. I think just playing around and understanding the benefits and the limitations of working with a bias render that is physically based is very, very valuable. So again, that is Cinema 4D R19 Pro Render. Again, check out some tutorials on lighting, because I really recommend stuff like that to you're gonna really be a rock star if you're a good real world lighter or real world camera person, photographer and videographer, because it's just gonna translate so well because of that physically based nature. All right, so there's your little introduction into the brand new Cinema 4D R19 Pro Renderer. Really interested to hear what you guys think about Pro Render. If you have any questions about it, definitely let me know in the comments section. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. But again, are you using Pro Render? Are you using another GPU rendering solution? Or is this the first foray into the whole GPU rendering phase that technology seems to be bringing us into? So I'd really love to hear what you guys are experiencing out there. Leave them in the comments section below, or hit me up on Twitter or Facebook. Really like interacting with all of you guys on there as well. Really appreciate, as always, all you guys watching. Let me know if you want to see more Pro Render stuff. We know we got David Ariew bringing out some more Octane tutorials. I hope to get on Octane now too. I just ordered my GPU for my eGPU box, so I can move off of my AMD cards and get some NVIDIA Titan TI action. So really excited about that. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next tutorial. Bye, everybody.